to Through the Veil podcast. My name is Camille.
I'm Elle.
This is the podcast where we seek to demystify, develop, and celebrate our spiritual gifts from a faith-based lens. And today we have with us Haymitch St. Stephen.
Thanks for having me. My name's Haymitch. I'm every time I introduce myself, it's different. So what comes up in this moment is to say artist, a writer, um, contemplative. Yeah, that feels true in this moment.
Okay. Why we invited Haymitch specifically to be on this podcast, Elle and I, and we've discussed this on the podcast previously, we went to a workshop back in August called IPP, um, Interpolarity Practice, and we met Haymitch there. At the workshop, it was taught by Thomas McConkey, who was also featured on a previous episode. We met Haymitch there. He's also been a student of Thomas's and just a fellow contemplative. And when I was there, I discovered that Haymitch had written a book, and it piqued my interest. And so I picked up a copy and I read it. Honestly, I think I read the book in like 2.5 days because it was just so gripping and it wasn't just the story he was telling about a friend of his, but it was like his own personal experiences throughout that blended in. And it was just really interesting and expansive. So we're going to talk about that as well today. If I had to, put the book into a box and give like categories that fit what it's about, I would say it's about self-growth, self-forgiveness, exploration, meditation, God, and angels from the other side, the influence of how the other side can step into our lives and make such a huge difference. So can you give us a little bit of background on this book? Here it is. It's called Friend of the Devil.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for reading it and just saying those kind words about it. The book was 6.5 years in the making. So at this point, it's such an honor and a gift to share it with people, and especially to have it resonate. It makes those 6+ years of writing and editing and rewriting feel worth it. But the story, which maybe listeners are familiar with, not necessarily, was from when I was a senior in high school. I got a phone call from a friend who explained that another mutual friend had been in a car accident the night before. And this was in Salt Lake City. And we didn't know many of the details at first. It was just like, I hope my friend's okay. That's scary, right? Come to find out that he was driving under the influence of alcohol and had crashed head on into a family in another car. In that car were a father, Chris Williams, his pregnant wife, Michelle, and 3 of their kids. In the crash, Michelle, the mother, and 2 of the kids were killed. And so immediately this went from just like, I hope my friend's okay, to like feelings and emotions beyond which I had ever experienced at that point in my life. I think I
That's
was
heavy.
17 or maybe 18 at the time. And so this book is an attempt I should say, Chris Williams, the father, pretty immediately and publicly forgave my friend Cameron for his involvement in the accident, which was its own miracle and its own wave of feelings and emotions, again, that I really had no basis for understanding. My Christian faith was, of course, helpful in sort of attempting to understand that, but over the years, I've continued to try and come to terms with what forgiveness in a situation like that even means. Chris ended up writing a beautiful book. I think it was published in 2012 called Let It Go, where he explores the whole situation from his perspective and, sort of beautifully portrays that among other things, it wasn't him. He didn't feel like it was him forgiving Cameron. He felt like it was Jesus forgiving Cameron through him, God working through him. So I highly recommend that book. And Chris, speaks publicly from time to time, and he often gets the question, like, what happened to the young man that you forgave? And I think that's natural for us to wonder, right? Like something in the human spirit wants to like have closure about this story, to know that forgiveness can and does matter. And so this book, Friend of the Devil, Cameron reached out to me, like I said, about 7 years ago, and um, expressed that he felt like the story needed closure, that Chris had done his part and he really needed to do his own part to sort of share the goodness that came out of this story, that still comes out of this story.
Yeah. Do you
And
mind
so
if I
this,
read a quick excerpt from Chris's book
please.
that's in your book? Because it's just so powerful.
Yeah, thanks.
Chris says, I had no idea who had just hit us, and my mind didn't think to consider if they were all right or not, or what circumstances might have caused them to cross the median and strike us. I simply looked at the car in silence. My thoughts went quiet. I felt at peace. And then I heard a voice that was not my own in my mind as clearly as if it had come from someone seated next to me. It wasn't a peaceful, whispered voice, nor was it the still, small prompting of the spirit. It was straightforward and filled with power, and the voice said, let it go.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The book continues to share some really like personal experiences that Chris and Cameron both had throughout their journey of forgiveness and self-forgiveness and moving forward and healing. Um, do you want to share some of these experiences or whatever else you feel compelled to share?
What comes to mind as you ask that question, Camille, is an experience I had where I got to go to lunch with both of them in the process of writing this book, which was a really wonderful experience. Um, Not least because Chris and Cameron both wrote their own forewords to this book. So I felt like that was such a gift to me as the writer, to have both of them sort of saying, here's why this book and this story matters. So the experience of having lunch with them was amazing. It was like watching the miracle of forgiveness play itself out before my eyes. It was like an uncle and a nephew catching up, right? Or like a young man and his mentor. Like clearly, Chris cares a lot about Cameron, and I got to see that firsthand. And Cameron cares a lot about Chris. And we had lunch, and I was mostly quiet, just sort of a fly on the wall. And um, when we finished lunch, we were leaving the restaurant, and a woman sort of flagged us down. Well, flagged Chris down and said, "Hey, are you Chris Williams?" And he politely said that he was, and just sort of this woman became emotional, and she just sort of shared how important his story and his book had been to her, and he was just so kind to take a moment with her, and from what I gathered, this happens to him a lot, and just gave this woman time to sort of process her feelings and emotions, and then she sort of, gathered herself. So this woman asked what happened to the young man from the car accident, from the story. And Chris just sort of turned and gestured to Cameron, who he and Cameron and I were just standing a few feet away. And if she was emotional before, it really poured out of her. It was like she was witnessing a miracle.
Yeah.
And you know, by any understanding I have of miracle, that's what she was witnessing, right? To know the background of the story and to see them together as friends really affected her. And it was just a tender moment that I think really encapsulates what I hope this book offers people from all perspectives, right? From Chris's, like, for all of us to find within ourselves the ability to forgive others, and to find within ourselves that ability to forgive ourselves, that power that doesn't come from us but comes through us.
You keep defining forgiveness as a miracle, and I am in complete agreement with that. But I think it's something that we often have underrated. It takes something that's this big and this like life altering for us to think about forgiveness in this way, right? In your experience as you wrote this book, um, how would you define miracle, and what did you learn? Did you come into this with the assumption that that's what this was, or how did that concept grow for you?
I came in expecting to find a framework that I could like, dissect or deconstruct and therefore like um, sort of put forward like here's the framework for forgiveness. Here's what Chris did, and here's how all of us can do that.
List A, B, C,
Yeah,
bullet it out.
right. And maybe I shouldn't be surprised that it wasn't that at all. It was who Chris was, his whole life leading up to this accident that allowed him, I think the way I say it in the book is that like his heart was full of such love and seeking for the divine that when his heart broke and broke open, like what poured out into the world is what we're calling forgiveness. It
Right.
was just this emanation of love that transcends human understanding. So I guess that's what I mean when I say miracle is it it confounds the rational mind. It's something else, right? It's not a linear step by step, although there are aspects to it that I think our rational mind can grab hold of, and I think that's helpful. But there's also like some secret sauce to it, some X factor. And so that's why I think I use words like miracle and transcendence
Yeah.
and God.
It's grace, that grace
Yeah.
Yeah,
spills over.
Yeah.
right. Because I was going to ask you, how do you think this forgiveness was possible? But you talked about Chris, how he had this life of, filling his heart with God's love so that when it broke open, it naturally spilled out. But it takes, two sides. There was a lot of work on Cameron's part too, so that he was somebody that Chris was told to forgive him right away, but like they got to the point where they could go to lunch together and it could seem like a nephew uncle dynamic. So there was a lot of
Right.
work on Cameron's part to like have that, level of relationship with him.
Right. And there's several chapters in the book dedicated to Cameron's journey through being arrested after the accident, going through the trial. I guess it wasn't a trial because there was no jury. It was like a judge's decision to either try him as a minor or as an adult. If he had been tried as an adult, he would have, I think it was like 67 and a half years in prison, right,
Yeah.
for 4 counts of vehicular manslaughter. Um, Fortunately, that didn't happen. He was tried as a minor and was therefore detained in the system till his 21st birthday. So, 3 years ish, which is a long time, I should say, for like any minor that gets put into the system. 3 years is like a pretty long time. But in the book, there's chapters dedicated to his process of therapy, his process through journaling, even a therapy session while he was in, it was called the Wasatch Detention Center, where his therapist invited Chris Williams to come in and have a person-to-person conversation. That was the first time they had met in person.
Wow.
And so there's moments like that along his journey that show Cameron's evolution, his own sort of spiritual path of coming to terms with what he'd done, feeling those feelings, and ultimately practicing the cultivation of empathy where he could do his best to feel for Chris and Chris's family.
Walk us through, if you can, the process that Cameron went through with this, because I imagine that, that path to self-forgiveness is hard, and oftentimes it's even harder than being forgiven by other people around us.
Yeah.
I imagine that the guilt that he faced at the beginning was just immense, and not in itself is a miracle on its own, right? The fact that he could live a constructive life and even a productive life after doing something like that. What was his process? Where did he start, and where is he now?
It's hard to pinpoint, and some things that come up are, his experience with therapy, which he was very resistant to at first, right? He found himself detained in the Wasatch Detention Center, and I think just like a fish out of water, right? Like he was depressed, he was suicidal. I mean, I explored a little bit in the book, but the reason he was using alcohol to begin with was because of his like clinical diagnosis of anxiety, right? So he was already a young man sort of spinning a little bit, trying to find his place in the world. After the accident, that really intensified. And his mental health was not in a good way. And I can't say enough about his parents and his family and the support system that he comes from, just really being there for him and encouraging him in therapy. They would do these family therapy sessions that Cameron speaks about really fondly, because I think he was scared to go into therapy himself because he didn't know what that really meant. But to have his parents there and to have occasionally his family members come in, and for them to not pull any punches, right? For them to express how this accident had affected their lives, those were sort of the first steps for him to practice empathy with people that he knew really well, that it was like his safe space where he could learn the basics of empathy and feeling those hard feelings. And then, like I said, when Chris came in, that was maybe 2 years into his process of therapy. So he had exercised those muscles significantly to that point. And Chris's selfless service to say, like, I'm gonna have a real conversation with you. And Chris didn't pull any punches either, right? Like, he let Cameron know how he was feeling. He let him know how difficult it was losing his wife and those children. But he did it from a place, as best I can tell, I wasn't in the room, but he did it from a place of love and wanting what was best for Cameron. And so, as much work as Cameron was putting in, I think he was being met by an incredible support system that was helping him make those changes in his life. Another one I'll note is journaling. I think that was really big for Cameron, and he allowed me to read some of his journal entries with him from those years that he was detained.
Something I wanted to bring up too that you said in the book, you talked about how depression and anxiety might prime us to access synchronicity more. And you said, and I quote, depression is our souls knowing that something deeper is ready to emerge. So can we talk about for a minute? Can you define synchronicity as you wrote about it in the book, and then what you mean by that concept of depression is our souls knowing that something deeper is ready to emerge?
Yeah, here I'm really leaning heavily on the work of Dr. Lisa Miller from Columbia University, and it's pretty hard science, right? She's doing neuroimaging and some really cool stuff to look at, like, what's going on in the brain with a lot of cases that we call depression. Because even that term is, we could pick that apart for a long time. Like, what do we mean by depression? But in a lot of cases, what her work is proving or bearing out is that it's like a sensitivity. It's like, I think she uses the words, a knock at the door for a spiritual awakening or for an awakened brain. And so I think that's kind of what I'm trying to point to, is this idea that, mental health, good and bad, but in this case, particularly poor mental health, is that opportunity for an awakened brain. It's a doorway to like a spiritual level up, so to speak.
What inspired you to spiritually level up so that you could write about these things? I mean, the book talks about a lot about being still and meditating. You even have some guided meditations in here, which are fantastic, by the way. So what in your own personal life got you to want to level up?
I think pain and suffering, like a lot of people, because I meditate a lot, all friends or associates will, say, like, oh, I need to meditate more. And my response is generally like, I don't know, maybe, right? Like, I don't know that I would have come to it had I not been in just a really bad way, like in a really thick cloud of darkness myself. That was based particularly on, my best friend from growing up, a mutual friend of Cameron's, died by suicide at the end of 2018. And he wasn't the first close friend to die by suicide. And I think I say in the book too that Cameron would have been on that list as well. Like, he certainly thought about taking his own life at a bunch of different points. And so I never wanted that to be part of my path or story. But this, and even though mental illness isn't something I deal with personally on a daily basis. It's interwoven with my story through the trials and struggles and sufferings of some of my closest friends. And so Brett is this other friend I'm speaking about. When Brett took his life, it just like sent me. Well, initially, I thought I was grieving properly. I thought I was like, his family asked me to speak at the funeral, which was a great honor. And I think being in that role, I felt like I was supporting other friends and family through the grieving process. But as I'm sure you both know, like grief isn't something you get around, right? I was spared some grief for a while, but about a year later, my bike got stolen out of my apartment building, of all things. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back, like this whole wave of grief that I thought, I had moved past, like caught up to me and just floored me, just knocked me out. And I was really depressed for several weeks. And I was in graduate school. I was just sort of going through the motions, doing the best that I could. And, just the way things happened, Thomas McConkie showed up he was a keynote speaker at this conference that I happened to be at in the Bay Area. And I had met Thomas years before and had learned to meditate from him at his gatherings in Salt Lake. And so I was like, oh man, this is like, perfect.
Cosmic sign.
Yeah, totally. And ever since then, I've really been a student of his in studying, the meditative and contemplative arts as he teaches them. And one of his teachers, John Kessler, who, created the IPP practice, and they've both just been huge lifelines for me. And that was sort of my gateway into a really deep contemplative lifestyle.
Very cool. Cameron had a really pivotal experience when he was detained. He was waiting to hear the results of the hearing to see if he was going to be tried as an adult or as a minor. And he was 17 when the accident occurred, but he was close to 18. Is that correct?
Yeah, in fact, he turned 8 in those 3 months before he was sentenced. He actually turned 18. He had his 18th birthday. So.
Right, exactly. So is it okay if I just read it? It's an experience he had with his grandmother who passed away. I thought it was so powerful. It says, while Cameron sat in the cell, he prayed. He doesn't remember the exact words of the prayer, but remembers it was intense. God was the only one he felt he could turn to, the only one whose love could get him through the events he would face when he walked back into that courtroom. So he offered up his soul to God. During that prayer, Cameron experienced something very personal that he shared with me in confidence. Upon further reflection, he felt it appropriate if I shared it here. Once he finished the prayer, he looked over and saw a silhouette of his grandmother who had passed away 5 years earlier. She was sitting right next to him. Her love surrounded him. He knew how much she cared for him. He had a feeling of peace, like everything was going to be okay. Whatever was about to happen, he was sure that things would turn out as they were supposed to. So I really appreciated that Cameron, upon further reflection, was like, actually, let's put it in the book, because I think sometimes people say, well, it was such a sacred, personal experience. I mean, it's just for me, right? I'm going to just keep it close to my heart and keep it just for me. I thought it was very generous of him to share it with everyone else too.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. And we went back and forth about that story because, like I said, he had mentioned it to me sort of in confidence, just as a friend, sort of conveying what the experience was like. And he had specifically asked me not to include it initially based on a feeling that he didn't want this book to be a religious book. As we explored the story, it was like undeniable that it was spiritual. Mm-hmm. So that was maybe the line that we were walking, is like, can we make it a spiritual book, but not necessarily religious? I don't know if we succeeded in that effort, but this is certainly, a profound story. Whatever one makes of it, it really comforted Cameron in his time of need. And just even as you're rereading it, Camille, like those are words that I wrote, but as you reread it, like something wells up inside of me that I can't explain. It feels like, peace, maybe, like, and as I say that, I'm picturing like capital P, peace, like it's God showing up as peace, or Cameron's grandmother showing up as peace.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean,
Um,
my first experience with my son, seeing my son after he passed away, he was also a silhouette. And it
wow.
was super powerful. It was dark. I could like it was just like a shining silhouette in a room that didn't have a lot of light in it. And he was smiling at me. And that was like so incredible. It was the best thing, best gift you could have given me. Wasn't expecting it. And it kind of moves into this part where you discuss something Thomas McConkie taught you. I'm going to just quote again. Thomas McConkie taught me a meditative practice which involves calling in support from unseen realms. Through this practice, one invites the influences of their spiritual counsel to be present. And I think it's interesting you actually call it that because we just interviewed a few weeks ago someone who wrote about a fictional book about this concept called The Council of Angels. And it's
Cool.
just kind of funny, like the same, yeah, wording, spiritual counsel to be present. So, who is part of our individual spiritual councils? These might be ancestors, deceased relatives, saints, enlightened beings, deities, or even fictional characters whose influence follows us. Really, any beings which influence us for good can be called upon for support at any time. So the practice goes. Or, as Thomas often asks his students, who are the beings that are eager for your success? You know, I've had friends who've had experiences with people on the other side who shared a similar passion for patriotism, for example, that had experiences with people that weren't considered their loved ones, but people that they weren't expecting to come over that were still eager for their success. I don't know. I think that it's more liberal than we realize. Our access to
Right.
people on the other side with similar goals, intentions, struggles, but certainly our loved ones are part of our spiritual councils as well.
I think we often draw a boundary in that sense of like, oh, it can only be our loved ones. And in this case with Cameron, it was. And oftentimes, maybe they're the ones that identify themselves to us because we know them. And so the impact will be notable. It'll be understandable to us in a way like that. But um, I think that in practice that's actually much larger. And I don't know why we should have to draw a boundary with it. It can only be within our family line. We get weird about it. We get sticky about it. Have you ever had any instances like that in your own life, Haymitch, where you feel like you've had that connection with those people in your spirit council?
Yeah, yeah. Two specific examples come to mind that I can share. One was actually, I had gone to a psychic foot zoner of
Nice.
all people that like at that point in my life, I've always been quite open-minded, but like everyone with everything, like I had to go through a process of being like, do I believe this, right? Like what is this? But she said some things to me. So her process was as she's like zoning your feet, she has she receives communication
Messages.
from ancestors, and she'll even specify like maternal grandfather, paternal grandmother, things like that. And a lot of what she said, it's like maybe it hasn't stuck with me or it wasn't super profound in the moment, but a few things she said like really have. One of those she said, you're I think it was the grandfather on my dad's side. I don't know which grandfather. Um, but she was like, "Oh, this guy's really funny. He's like kind of telling some jokes or something like this." And she says he just wants you to know that like there's a reason that certain traumas have been passed down through your father's line, and he knows the reason for those traumas, but not to worry about them because like they end with you. And I was just like struck, like it just really hit me. And my dad is such a beautiful soul. Like he had a traumatic brain injury a few years ago, and he just gets tender and more tender with passing years as he ages. Um, but he's also always had like I call it his stress bone. Like if the situation gets too complex, his stress really comes out. And I see it because I know it in myself, and I see it in my siblings, especially my brothers. We can get really stressed really quickly. And somehow in that moment, it was like, my dad's dead grandfather was telling me, like, just let go. Like, you don't need to carry this anymore. And it felt so good to like just release it in that. And all I can say that allowed me to release it was just being seen by that ancestor, or feeling seen by that ancestor. It was like, whoo, this deep sigh of relief. And, I probably still get stressed from time to time, but it feels significantly less so. Um, so that's one instance of like a direct communication. Another one that's alive for me right now is I'm sure y'all are both familiar with the telepathy tapes. Have you been listening
Oh
to
yeah.
this?
Mhm.
It's like really hit me hard, and it's been such a gift in my own spiritual practice. After I finished listening to season one, um, I had this feeling of like wanting to connect with any non-speakers. So for people who are listening to this that might not know, it's covers like non-speaking individuals, most of whom are younger folks with severe autism, and their ability to communicate um, beyond the seeing realm, right? To communicate telepathically or with um, other beings that we're not
Spirit. Yeah.
seeing. Yeah, spirits. Um, so after I finished listening to it, I started to wonder, like, I had this like impulse of like, oh man, if there's any of these kids in my sphere of influence in my life that I might help like them express their personalities. Like I gotta find this out. But I drew a blank. I'm like, I don't know any non-speakers. And like that day I was over at my brother's house and I was like, I should ask him and his wife if they know anybody, like if they have any friends with non-speaking kids. And like as soon as the phrase came out of my mouth, I realized, and my sister-in-law addressed this. She's like, oh, like my nephew has lived his whole life as a non-speaker. And I was like, oh my gosh, James. Like I've met James. I know James. Um, and I don't know what inspired this, but ever since that moment, I've been sitting in my daily meditations. I've basically been sitting as like open awareness, trying to connect with James. And I don't know what will continue to come from it, but so far it's like James has taught me so much. Like just holding him in my heart has taught me so much about myself and about life. And my hope is that I can somehow be helpful to his grandparents, who are his caregivers. His dad passed away when he was young, but um, helping them figure out, how do we bring James's personality, how do we communicate with him? Because according to this podcast that I really am feeling good about, like there's a whole hyper conscious being in there that just doesn't communicate through verbal language the way we do. And so anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but it's something that's really alive for me lately, of like practicing communication with um, conscious beings who are not in my immediate vicinity, right? Not in my like materialistic surroundings.
Yeah, I've shared
Love
this
that.
before on the podcast, but I had an experience as a college student, as an intern at a special ed church program where it was called Special Ed Seminary, and we would have like a buddy. And so I was a buddy with a nonverbal um, teenager, and we would sit in this church class, and I would watch other people that had been buddies longer than me and see how sometimes they would raise their hand and they would be able to telepathically communicate with their nonverbal buddy through what we've discussed on the podcast before. Is we believe like when people say through the information field, we've talked about that on an episode with the quantum physicist. We wonder if really the spirit is the shepherd of this information field that allows us the communication not only between heaven and earth, but between individuals on earth that can't communicate otherwise, right? So this other buddy raised his hand and said, okay, well, Ryan over here wants to share how much he loves Jesus. And I just feel it brimming out of him. And I had to share because Ryan really wanted me to share in this moment. And I could just see like a smile on Ryan's face and a little tear in his eye. And it was so beautiful. And I eventually learned, I had my own experience a few weeks later with my buddy where I was like, oh my gosh, she wants to say something. It's my turn to raise my hand. I gotta go. So it was just special, you know?
Yeah.
I think we often I don't know. In our particular quarter of the vineyard, we're dealing a lot with spirits through the veil, but there is a lot of spirit to spirit interaction I think that we also overlook as just human beings. That is what a rich experience that we can have, right? And I really love that. That podcast is all over the world right now. It's
Yes.
being talked about. I had no less than 10 people like that when it dropped, when it debuted. I had no less than 10 people send it to me like, you need to watch this. Like, this is
Yeah.
everything that you are about. And I'm like, yes,
Yeah.
it's popularizing the notion, I think, that we are way more connected to each other than we think we are, and way
Right.
more connected to the other side than we think we are. I think it's opening up a lot of doors in a lot of beautiful ways to people who may not have understood these concepts and
Mhm.
just how far reaching they can get. I think it's amazing. I'm so glad you brought that up. Little plug, you should go watch
Yeah.
it. If you haven't watched it yet, go watch it.
Totally.
Another experience I just can't not talk about, we have to include this, is that when Chris and Cameron met for the second time, this was a lot further along in Cameron's self growth and self forgiveness journey. And I'm going to just read again. He says, Cameron was given the opportunity to ask Chris questions as part of his growth experience. This was a therapy assignment. So the last question Cameron asked was, "Is there anything I can do for you?" So Cameron's asking that to Chris. Chris told him to keep working hard and never give up. Be true to yourself, he said, and do things because you want to, not because everyone else wants you to. Understand what you believe. He told Cameron again how he thinks of his wife and kids who have passed. This is the best part. Chris explained how he wanted them to be with Cameron and help them with his work. Can you imagine that? The person whose life Cameron had shattered telling him that he wants his deceased family to be Cameron's angelic influences. That was like a huge
Powerful.
mic drop for me when I read it. That's amazing. And then it also said somewhere else, I can't remember exactly where in the book, that about 5 years after the incident, Chris heard, oh no, 5 years after Cameron's grandparents had passed, he heard a voice from the other side, um, like something that they communicated with Chris on behalf of Cameron. I can't remember what they said, um, but it was something that kind of helped further along their relationship.
Yeah. I think they essentially just said thank you, right?
Yes, that
Or
was it.
that like
Yeah.
um, the way I'm thinking about remembering the story now is that it probably was less about the words that they said and more about like the essence of what they were communicating to Chris was thank you for um, sorry, thank you for watching out for our grandchild. That's just like so beautiful to me, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm.
Again, like beyond my understanding, just to know that like that we belong to each other and that like we're people beyond this realm are watching out for us.
Yeah, and we're all part of God's human family. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that Cameron's ancestors who had already passed at the time of the incident on the other side were praying for Chris and his family who
Right.
were
Yeah.
struggling with this tremendous, tremendous tragedy. I think we're so connected. Um, and that's just a beautiful concept to think about.
Well, you can draw that line straight across, right? Chris was praying that his wife and his son, it was two sons that he lost, right? That they were
A
both
son and a daughter. Yeah.
a son and a daughter, that they were both helping Cameron, right? And then Cameron's grandparents reciprocated. They
Yeah.
came and thanked Chris for that. It's all circular. Like we all belong, like you said, Camille, to that same human family. And we are all really looking out for each other on the other side. Like how beautiful, how beautiful. It's not that we're bound to one specific trajectory. We can really, just like you can be that ministering angel for someone here on earth,
Mm.
so can you on the other side as well, and reach that boundary of love in such amazing and unexpected ways. And I imagine it was incredibly validating for Chris as well to have that experience and supportive. I mean, even though he had worked through his process of forgiveness and reached that point, I imagine it was still hard. And it's a choice that you have to make every single day, right? So how amazing. How amazing that he could have that support even from the other side as well. One kind of last question to take us home here with you, Haymitch. I find this whole topic of forgiveness to be really fascinating, and it's perhaps one that we never really have to approach until we find ourselves facing this precipice, this moment where we really have to make that choice to understand what that means to us. How do you think writing this book helped you understand the impact forgiveness has in our lives?
As I search my heart right now, this feels like the one thing left unsaid so far. As I wrote this book, I learned that in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, there are two really common translations of what we now in English say as forgiveness. And one of those is I don't know if I'm pronouncing these right, but it's something like charizomai. It's like it's more like grace. It's like unconditional, abundant, overflowing love from God to humanity, and it's already right here, waiting to heal us and transform us. The other translation um, is more like it means to send away. It's like the conditional ability and willingness for each of us as individuals to send away our pain and suffering. And so that's like that's a maybe a good summary of like how I see self-forgiveness and forgiveness, like that dance that all of us are, sort of wrapped up in, is that God, divinity is so ready and willing to transform us. And as we learn to let go of those things that don't serve us, that's just what happens. Just like it scoops us up and it transfer. It's like as soon as we learn to let go of non-transformation, we realize that what's already always happening is transformation.
That's a powerful concept, really, to grab hold on. It's kind of a little bit like the atonement.
Yeah,
Something that you can
yeah,
spend your entire life studying and trying to do. There's some kind of a delicate dance between grace and will, right? It, what you allow to occur within yourself is what will occur within yourself that is actually already happening within yourself if you'd only sit back and recognize it.
Yeah. That's really beautiful. I want to read this last quote. Chris said this to Cameron in their meeting that I just addressed. Cameron asked him, "After all that I've done to your family, how is it that you were able to forgive me?" Chris's answer was surprising. "If there is anything you have seen me do or heard me say or have read about me regarding the forgiveness, you should know that it was merely the Savior working through me." So I thought that was really beautiful. Like we can let go and we can allow ourselves to be that faucet. The Savior is the water, right? And He's the one who can pour that love through us. We just have to like stop blocking it and just allow it to flow.
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
It reminds me of I think it's Father Richard Rohr who points out that Jesus never said worship me; he said follow me.
Mm.
So
Right.
it's like, and I put a quote to that effect somewhere in the book that like,
Yeah. Yeah.
worshiping Jesus is great, like but it's fairly risk free, right? But following Jesus asks, like, it risks everything, because it asks us to give up all that we think we are for something greater. And so I just because yeah, like I love that analogy, Camille, of like Jesus is the water, right? And we're that faucet, we're that container. And also it like seems like what Jesus is inviting us into is to like also be water,
Yeah.
as we sort of expand our conscious awareness, our loving awareness. um, we have, I have a long ways to go on that path. um, but hopefully I'm becoming more and more like Jesus.
Yeah. Don't we all hope that?
Yeah.
That's the goal. Um, that is fantastic and amazing. I am going to leave this conversation with so many great thoughts to turn over about the nature of that grace and allowing that to be like the facilitator of that in my life to move through me to like. I mean, we always talk about Christ being the light, and we're trying to reflect on other people,
Mm.
right? But it is, I think, one of the most interesting concepts about this whole notion is that there's still a lot of us that has to be moved intentionally for these things to occur. It has to be our choice to forgive. It has to be our choice to work through, our own emotions and our own blockages like Cameron did. It's a journey, it's a process. Miracles don't happen. Sometimes they do. But a lot of the times the bigger ones in our life, we are helping facilitate those miracles by allowing Christ to move through us. And once we have that happen, once we get out of the way, once we allow that light to move through us, we see the miracle. It happens all on its own. So that's I'm gonna be thinking about a lot of these things. Thanks for all the thought material, Hamish.
Yeah, a lot of thought
Yeah,
material. If you
me
want
too.
more, grab his book. Where can people
Yeah.
find your book, Haymitch?
If you go to stillpoint.life, you can buy it from my website. Yeah, thank you.
Which is
Stillpoint.life.
where stillpoint.life. And this is where people can also find you.
Yeah, I keep there's some different ways to interact with me on there. It's mostly through my sort of bizarre spiritual art projects, but hopefully there's at least one person listening to this that draws them in.
Which is a whole other facet of thing we haven't got to yet.
Yeah.
And maybe a whole other episode. Do you do sculpture? Yes, it's a different.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love. I love shapes and spaces, and really, I am fascinated with spiritual experiences. So, like, what can they be designed, and if so, what are the elements that go into designing a space that's more likely to facilitate spiritual and transformative
Okay,
experiences?
we're gonna have to have you back to talk about that.
Yeah, we didn't
I
even
would
get
love
there.
it. I would love that.
Well, thank you so much for coming and being with us today. This was such a fascinating and touching discussion. Any of you listening, if you want to follow our podcast and share with your friends, we'd really appreciate it. The sooner after you get a notification that we've dropped a new episode, the sooner you watch or listen to it, the more it helps boost us in the algorithm. So we appreciate that. You can find us on our website, throughtheveilpodcast.com. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you so much, Haymitch. We really appreciate your time.
So much love.
Everybody.